Okay, so this is a chapter on bioenergetics, and this is also an introduction to metabolism. And from now onwards, we will only focus on metabolism, right? We have all the knowledge that we need once we finish this chapter 13, so we can appreciate all the metabolism chapters going forward. Okay, and so what does this chapter entails? It basically asks you to understand some of the basic concepts that you may have already learned in your general chemistry classes, in your organic chemistry classes, or in your general biology classes. So you will see that many things you already know, and we have been talking about them, reviewing them in this class. So if it sounds a little bit boring, I know, please, I apologize, but we still should review them. Okay. So life needs energy, right? All living organisms, they are built of complex structures, right? We need to make our DNA, RNA, proteins, hormones, and so on. And so if you need to build these complex structures from individual units, monomers, typically you are actually doing a process where entropy is decreasing, right? You are taking multiple units of monomer molecules and you are actually synthesizing one or few molecules of these large complex structures. And so in such processes, you can imagine that because it results in lower entropy, these processes are possible only when you can provide energy, right? So energy is spent in these processes of building complex structures. And of course, we should always remember that we have tons of energy around us on this planet, fortunately. And that's the energy from the sun. And we are working very aggressively to harvest that energy, so we can actually, produce solar cells and, not worry about our dependence on fossil fuel, for example. Okay, so planet is very well evolved, right? If you look at that way. So when we talk about metabolism, typically students and faculties, they mean, when they say metabolism, oftentimes they may mean that they are talking about catabolism. Okay. So I just want to define this at the onset, what metabolism is. Okay. Metabolism is sum of all chemical reactions in the cell, whether they are involved in degradation of complex biomolecules to create simple molecules, right? Like taking proteins and then making ATP, or taking smaller molecules and making larger molecules. All those reactions, we call them together as metabolism. Okay, so, and these reactions are all related to each other. They are talking to each other. The enzymes are talking to each other. They are sensing constantly. So the pathways that produce energy, right? If you digest, like, for example, sugar molecules, fat molecules, or proteins, you make ATP, energy rich molecules, right? Those pathways are known as catabolism. Okay. So energy producing pathways are catabolism. We talked about that in the beginning of the lectures, in this class. And some pathways are primarily using energy to build complex structures, and that's anabolism. Okay, that's what biosynthesis pathways. So you have to keep that in mind. And even in this class, oftentimes I will say metabolism, but I might be referring to catabolism. Okay, that's how much interused these two words are. But just keep that in perspective. And so when we are carrying out metabolism, laws of thermodynamics still apply to all living organisms. No laws are broken, remember. Okay. So, zeroth laws of thermodynamics, first law of thermodynamics, second law of thermodynamics, third law of thermodynamics, they're all conserved. Still, they work with the living system. So you can easily say that living organisms cannot create energy from nothing and cannot destroy energy into anything, nothing, right? But they can transform energy from one form to the another form. And when you are actually transforming, carrying out a process, biological processes, typically living organisms must increase the entropy of the universe. That's the second law, right? Second law of the thermodynamics, if you remember, it says that entropy of the universe increases during all chemical and physical processes, right? Universe is made up of system and surrounding. So that law is also maintained, right? And so one other thing that you need to know is that many times cells are actually breaking down a component and building another component, right? So living systems must be able to utilize whatever usable energy they can extract from their sources and utilize those energy to create whatever new biosynthetic molecules they are making, and they should be able to release any energy that is not utilized back to their surrounding in form of heat. Okay, so again, going back to the energetics within the cell, remember I have been emphasizing this again and again. Energetics within the cell are not standard. Oftentimes chemists and biologists, we talk about standard free energy, but the actual energy in the cell are not standard. Okay, so I'm just showing you that again, that actual free energy in the cell is a sum of standard free energy. Remember, the standard condition is when you have temperature of 298 degree Kelvin, and when reactants and products concentration are present at 1 molar. Okay, and if it's gas, gases have to have a partial pressure of 1 atmosphere pressure, right? That's what standard condition is. That's when delta G naught here is. But actual free energy in the cell is sum of delta G standard, right? Delta G naught plus RT ln this factor right here. Concentration of product divided by concentration of reactants. And you also know that standard free energy changes are additive, right? For example, if there is a standard free energy of delta G1 from going to A to B, and delta G naught 2 for B going to C, then if you have to calculate standard free energy for A going to C, then it will be just the algebraic sum of the two reactions, right? That's what standard that's how standard free energy for A to C can be calculated, because standard free energy changes are additive in nature. And so again, I have showed you this before. When there is no driving force, when delta G actual is 0, then delta G naught becomes minus RT ln, the factor that I talked to you in the previous slide. And so when delta G is negative, equilibrium constant is more than 1, that process will move forward without any problem. Energetically, it will be reaction will proceed forward. If it's 0, it will be at equilibrium, and positive, it will go in the reverse reaction. You know that already, we talked about that. So what are the standard free energy changes of some common chemical reactions? I'm showing you this table that actually lists 4 types of reactions. So hydrolysis reactions, rearrangements, then we are talking about elimination of water and oxidation with molecular oxygen, oxidation reaction, okay? And on the right hand side, you are seeing the standard free energy change associated with these reactions, okay? So if you look at these hydrolysis reaction, and they are showing you hydrolysis of acid and anhydride, esters, amides, and peptides and glycosides, what you'll notice is that hydrolysis reactions tend to be strongly favorable. You can see mostly delta G is strongly highly negative, right? Rearrangement reactions, right? Like, for example, transfer of conversion of glucose 1-phosphate to glucose 6-phosphate. And this reaction happens with phosphoglucomutase, an enzyme, but we'll talk about that later on, is minus 7.3. Fructose 6-phosphate to glucose 6-phosphate, it's kind of an isomerization reaction, a movement of carbonyl group from one place to the other, is near equilibrium, near zero delta G, standard free energy. Okay, so isomerization reactions like this tend to have smaller free energy change. Okay. Look at the oxidation. Okay, oxidation of glucose, complete oxidation of 1 mole of glucose by 6 moles of oxygen molecule is highly exergonic. The standard free energy is minus 2840 kilojoule per mole, as close to 3000 kilojoule per mole. Just think about it, let it digest. When you have 16 carbon fatty acid shown here, palmitate, you will need 23 moles of oxygen. And that alone, that reaction alone produces about 10,000 kilojoule per mole energy. Okay. So you can see that complete oxidation of reduced compounds like, palmitate and glucose in this case are highly exergonic, thermodynamically favorable. And this is how chemotropes like us obtain most of our energy. We take reduced fuel and we break them down, not in one step as shown here, but in several steps. Okay. And so that we can actually control these processes and extract all this energy. Remember, this is standard free energy. Free energy is a standard term, right? So as long as you are oxidizing glucose to 6 carbon dioxide and 6 water molecule, it doesn't matter how you do it, you will get that much free energy at the end of the day. And so in biochemistry, the oxidation of reduced fuels with oxygen is stepwise and a controlled process and involves several enzymes. Okay. But you have to always remember, just because a process is thermodynamically favorable doesn't mean that it will happen rapidly, right? So that means there has to be kinetic control if these reactions have to happen, and enzymes do that beautifully. Cool? Very cool, right? So standard free energy changes are additive. We just talked about that. And this property of standard free energy is utilized, okay, in coupling a reaction that is endergonic to a reaction that is exergonic. And that is how an endergonic reaction is made to happen in the cell. It is oftentimes coupled with a highly exergonic reaction. And that coupling happens through common intermediates. Okay, it says through a common intermediate, but there could be more than one. What do I mean by that? Very simple to understand. I already, I think, alluded this to you earlier, but I am showing you a slide that will explain to you. Okay. Think about this. If you were to put glucose, if you have to make glucose 6-phosphate, which your cells do when they metabolize glucose, first step, simple reaction, standard reaction will be to take an inorganic phosphate, PI, and add it onto glucose to make glucose 6-phosphate and water, right? But that reaction is enderganic. You can see standard free energy is plus 13.8 kilojoule per mole. So if you took that half reaction on the top and you couple it to a highly exergonic reaction, half reaction, which is shown here at the bottom, which is hydrolysis of ATP to generate ADP and inorganic phosphate. That reaction, that half reaction is minus 30.5 kilojoule per mole, highly exergonic. And I'm showing you here, you can see here, ATP hydrolysis itself is minus 30.5 kilojoule per mole. So you can couple the top reaction, which is endergonic, with an exergonic half reaction, which is at the bottom, and link them through some common intermediates. In this case, the two common intermediates are inorganic phosphate, PI, and water molecules. Then overall coupled reaction, all you have to do is sum them up, right? So you can see that PI and water will get cancelled out on both sides, and all you will be left with ATP plus glucose going to ADP plus glucose 6-phosphate. And that's, you can just algebraic sum of those two numbers will be minus 16.7 kilojoule per mole. So overall reaction is now highly exergonic. Cool? That's what energy coupling means. And that's what is shown here at the bottom as well. And you'll see this reaction a little bit later on. Phosphoenol pyruvate converting to pyruvate. This is another reaction of glycolysis that we'll study at length. So exergonic reaction is taking phosphoenol pyruvate, a highly activated molecule, hydrolysis of that to generate pyruvate and inorganic phosphate, look, minus 62 kilojoule per mole, highly exergonic. And you couple that to an endergonic reaction, which is the synthesis of ATP from ADP and inorganic phosphate. That reaction is plus 30.5 kilojoule per 0.5 kilojoule per mole. You can couple these two reactions again through the common intermediates inorganic phosphate and water, writing overall coupled reaction in the form of phosphoenol pyruvate plus ADP, giving you pyruvate plus ATP molecule. That overall free energy is minus 31.4. So this reaction will happen in the cell without any problem. Okay, so this is how biology works, biochemistry works. Reactions that are highly endergonic are made to happen in the cell by coupling it with an exergonic reaction through common intermediates. Cool? Very easy to understand. Now, this slide is literally, I don't want you to know much from it other than to just know that these are all individual reactions that are shown here in your cells. They really do happen. Okay, and all of them are catalyzed by enzymes. And many times these intermediates are being channeled and funneled into different pathways. They are coming from different pathways. They are going into different pathways as a feed molecules. But the one that we'll study in this class is right here, shown here in the yellow, okay? Where you take glucose molecule on the top, remember, complete oxidation of glucose to generate carbon dioxide and water is highly exergonic. It has a standard free energy of minus 2,850 kilojoule per mole. But I also told you that oxidation of that glucose molecule doesn't happen in one step. It happens in multiple steps. And so the glucose molecule is sitting here on the top in this, and you are producing ATP and water molecule and carbon dioxide here all the way at the bottom. Okay. So you have to go through this entire process. We'll talk about each one of these reactions, different pathways. Okay. They show you citric acid cycle, right? They show you glycolysis. They show you gluconeogenesis, where you produce new glucose molecules from some intermediates. And at the bottom, they're showing you oxidative phosphorylation process, chapter 19 things. Okay, so this is all you learn, how this happens. Now, these are some slides I have for you to review. There is nothing to really, go over this. It talks about homolytic cleavage, heterolytic cleavages that you know already, so I'm not going to waste any time. Common nucleophiles and electrophiles in the biochemical reactions are shown here. All the nucleophiles are shown here on the left-hand side, and the electrophiles are shown here on the right-hand side. You can see they are showing you negatively charged oxygen here as a nucleophile, negatively charged sulfhydryl group, a standard carbanion, sorry. Then they're also showing you an uncharged amine group as a nucleophile. That lone pair on the amine can act as a nucleophile. They're also showing you imidazole molecule in the unprotonated form. That nitrogen lone pair can actually act as a nucleophile, right? And hydroxide ion. Similarly, they're showing you electrophiles here, right? Carbonyl carbon, is electrophilic in nature, right? That bonding pair between carbon and oxygen is not equally shared between the two atoms. It's more towards the oxygen atom, and therefore that carbon has a delta positive charge. So nucleophile, as shown here in R, can actually attack that. And they're showing you arrow pushing. If I were you, I will be writing these individual functional groups on the piece of paper and pushing those arrows and generating charge and intermediates. Okay, I will not be just looking at it and saying, oh, I understand this. This is a protonated imine group that actually can act as an electron sink. You can imagine that a nucleophile can attack that electrophilic carbon, and then you can push that, and that becomes that's where the electron sinking happens. You can have a phosphate group where nucleophile can attack, and I will show you all of these in these coming slides. Exactly shown here, right? So here I'm showing you again carbonyl, right? In B, you are seeing a delocalization of an electron pair, a carbanion, onto the adjacent carbonyl. And so you know that formation of carbanion is more stable because of this resonance hybrid structure that you can write. That lone pair that will be produced as a result of proton abstraction on that alpha carbon can be delocalized on the carbonyl oxygen, right? Same thing they're showing you about imine here. So carbanion adjacent to the imine can be easily delocalized, right? You can activate a carbonyl with a metal ion. Oxygen, remember, has two lone pairs on it. So if you have, let's say, magnesium, that magnesium ion will actually form electrostatic interactions with the negative charge cloud of the carbonyl oxygen and make that carbonyl more electrophilic. Same thing happened when a general acid actually forms a hydrogen bond with the carbonyl oxygen. All this you know, it's nothing new. I'm just repeating myself, I know, but you have to keep these things in perspective. Now I want to show you some reactions. Always students say that, oh, do I really need organic chemistry to understand biochemistry? And I always say, yes, you do, because you will see how biochemistry reactions, you will be able to appreciate more how biochemical reactions happen once you have a good understanding of organic chemistry. So I'm sure in your organic class, you have heard about aldol condensation and Claisen ester condensation reactions, right? Yeah. So both aldol condensation and Claisen ester condensation reactions, if you recall, it's a carbanion that serves as a nucleophile, right? And a carbonyl carbon acts as an electrophile. So that's what they're showing you, aldol condensation reaction to create this aldol. You know what happens? In glycolysis, there's a reaction that is catalyzed by this enzyme aldolase. Aldolase will do the reverse reaction, okay? It will actually take a 6-carbon sugar and convert it to a 3-carbon sugar, 3-carbon compounds, okay? So reverse of aldolase reaction is seen in biochemistry, as we'll see in glycolysis. In Krebs cycle, we synthesize a molecule named as citrate, okay? And in that synthesis of citrate molecule has similarities with the Claisen ester condensation reaction, where actually you take again a carbanion and make an ester. In fatty acid oxidation process, you will see that a beta keto acid. So I want to again refresh your organic chemistry here. Okay. Why is it this molecule is called a beta keto acid? Think about it. Beta keto, right? So that carboxyl carbonyl is right there. So alpha carbon is next to it and beta is this carbonyl. So beta keto acid. It's a beta keto acid, right? Beta keto acids undergo decarboxylation. Why would that be? You can see here, if you are organic chemistry inclined, you will notice here that to decarboxylate, you have to break that carbon-carbon bond, carbon in the black and carbon in the red. And so if you took O- here and push that to create carbon dioxide, you will have to break that carbon-carbon bond, and thus bond pair will have to go and reside on that black carbon, right? So that will be a carbanion. But that is a carbanion which where negative charge can easily be delocalized to that adjacent carbonyl carbon, right? Carbonyl group. So therefore, the formation of carbanion at that alpha position is favored. And that's how decarboxylation happens. These are very important organic chemistry concepts, but you have to draw them and push the arrows to really feel. So carbanions are involved, you saw. What about carbocations? It turns out that carbocations are also involved. Cholesterol is a very important molecule, right? It plays a crucial role in membrane structure, right? And it is also a precursor for the synthesis of bile acids, if you remember, vitamin D, right? And several steroid hormones. So in cholesterol biosynthesis, there are several steps. And one of the early steps in cholesterol biosynthesis involves this enzyme prenyl transferase, okay? And this prenyl transferase, what it does is it catalyzes the condensation of isopentenyl pyrophosphate and dimethyl allyl pyrophosphate, okay? Right here, the molecule that is shown on the top. So again, for exam purpose, you don't have to memorize the whole reaction. Okay, I'm not going to ask you to draw anything, but the key features you have to remember how the reaction happens, how carbocations are involved in this. It turns out that dimethyl allyl pyrophosphate, if you look at the structure, you will notice that it is an allyl group with 2-methyl at the terminal carbon, right? That's why dimethyl allyl. So if you actually were to break that bond, pyrophosphate is 2 of the phosphate group right here. You know that. So if you have to remove PPI, which is the pyrophosphate, PPI, those 2 phosphate molecule, that carbon-oxygen bond has to break. and it has to break in the direction going towards the left as shown here. So it will be pyrophosphate O minus is the leaving group, right? Pyrophosphate is the leaving group, right? So that bond pair goes with the leaving group, PPI. As a result, what you have is this dimethyl allylic carbocation, the CH2 plus. You know that dimethyl allylic carbocation is a good species. Why? Because you can take that positive charge and delocalize it. So it is fairly stable. It will form. No issues. So it does form. And once it forms, then isopentenyl pyrophosphate condenses to give this molecule called geranyl pyrophosphate, shown here at the bottom. And in this, arrow pushing is like this. You can see a general base can pick up that proton right here, and then you move that bond to form a double bond between that carbon and that carbon. And then at that point, you have to push that double bond to form a bond with the carbocation. And that's what generates this geranyl pyrophosphate. So carbanions, carbocations. Now let's talk about a different type of a reaction called isomerization reactions. Isomerization reactions tend to have standard free energy near zero, not necessarily 0, but maybe -2, -5, somewhere near zero. But they can still happen because actual free energy in the cell might still be negative, right? So one isomerization reaction example is again a reaction of glycolysis called glucose 6-phosphate converting to fructose 6-phosphate. In glucose 6-phosphate, you know that terminal group is aldehyde group, shown here in the pink, most important part of this molecule for now. Phosphohexose isomerase will take that molecule and convert it into fructose 6-phosphate. And the changes that you are seeing here is that a switch of carbonyl group between 1 and 2 carbon. That's all. Carbonyl from 1 is switched to carbonyl at 2 position, a ketone. Right? How does that happen? It turns out it's very cool the way it happens inside the active site of this phosphohexose isomerase enzyme. There is a general base and there is a general acid. General base on the top, they are showing you here in the B1, and general acid they are showing here in B2 form, which is already has the proton on it, general acid, right? And they are showing you only pink portion of the molecule. So a general base will abstract a proton, and then you will end up forming a double bond between carbon and carbon. And when you do that, carbonyl oxygen double bond has to be pushed, and this carbonyl oxygen bond, this oxygen will pick up a proton from the general acid, and it will become an intermediate that looks like this here in this parenthesis, enediol intermediate. You can see there are 2 alcohol on the adjacent carbon, enediol. And then this enediol is not very stable as the reaction proceeds. The same general so B2 molecule, right, which was acting as a general acid, will now act as a general base and pick up that proton, and then the electron movement happens as shown here, and that B1 will now act as a general acid, and you will basically have switched. You have formed this species that exists in fructose 6-phosphate. So by using simple general acid base chemistry, not nucleophilic catalysis in this case, you are easily able to isomerize glucose 6-phosphate to fructose 6-phosphate. Beautifully, right? How cool this is. Think about it. And in that reaction, glutamine and histidine are involved, as a general acid base. All right. So with that, what about free radicals? Free radicals are involved in biochemistry, and answer is yes, plenty. Okay. And here, just to give you an example, I'm showing you a reaction that happens inside the cells of E. coli, especially when the E. coli are grown in anaerobic medium, oxygen deprived medium. Okay. So for the survival of E. coli, you still need to make heme. Okay, the molecule that is shown here on the extreme right. And so the synthesis of this molecule happens from this precursor molecule that is shown here on the extreme left. And the enzyme is shown here on the top here. Again, don't try to memorize the name of the enzyme here for exam purposes at least, but try to enjoy the chemistry here. And in this, a radical is involved. Okay, scientists have done enzymology experiments to prove that indeed electrons are produced. Okay, and radicals are involved. And so they are showing you a radical will abstract. You see arrow, one-headed arrow here. They are showing to show you radical reaction. They're showing you the generation of this radical here, right? And then a decarboxylation reaction that generates an electron and carbon dioxide, and you generate this species, right? This is the vinyl side chain of this molecule. So yeah, but when E. coli has oxygen-rich medium, then this reaction doesn't happen; is not needed. Okay, so this reaction when you have oxygen, this reaction is an oxidative decarboxylation reaction, and is totally catalyzed by a totally different enzyme. Okay, so in biochemistry, you will also see certain group transfer reactions. Okay. What is a group transfer reaction? I'm showing you on the top. For example, X can be transferred with Y, right? Let's say acyl halide you have, for example. A nucleophile will come, it will push, you will form this tetrahedral intermediate. Because it's an intermediate, they're showing you in parentheses, right? You can see carbon, 4 bonds to carbon, right? And then in this case, leaving group leaves as X. We talked about chymotrypsin catalysis. You know this very well. I'm just re-showing you everything so you understand. And so you have done the group transfer reaction. It turns out that in biology, you will see a lot of involvement of phosphate groups. And phosphate groups play very, very important role in phosphoryl group transfer reaction. And they're just showing you how phosphate groups can exist in 4 different forms. And you can create a resonance hybrid form where each of the phosphorus oxygen bond is sort of a single bond and a partial double bond. Okay, and this is tetrahedral in nature, as they're showing you in this right hand side. So what kind of reaction can happen? Can you give me some example? Yes, again, glycolysis. Glucose, once glucose has to come, once glucose needs to be metabolized, remember insulin receptor pathway, glucose is brought into the cell, for example, GLUT4 receptor. Once glucose is in, first reaction that happens on glucose is generation of glucose 6-phosphate. Okay, 6 position hydroxyl group will accept a terminal gamma phosphate from ATP to generate glucose 6-phosphate and ADP. That reaction is shown here. And that reaction happens, where hydroxy group of the glucose attacks that electrophilic phosphorus atom, and the leaving group is ADP. And the reaction, is kind of SN2 type of a reaction, where incoming nucleophile is forming a bond with phosphorus while the leaving group is leaving. Cool. So metabolic pathways also carry out redox reactions that involved electrons, right? Transfer of electrons. As I said, most of the main reaction of metabolism is oxidation of a reduced fuel, remember? So yeah, so this is a reaction that again is a reaction that happens inside your liver, importantly, and we'll talk about that later on. This is a molecule called lactate. Okay, you should start to memorize some of these key intermediates. Pyruvate, for example, you must know the structure of pyruvate and lactate. Okay, you will see them a lot. So this is a reaction that actually happens inside, various cells. And this is an oxidation reaction. You can see A secondary alcohol is being converted to a ketone, lactate to pyruvate. And this reaction can happen in both ways depending on what the substrate is. And lactate dehydrogenase will do that. Dehydrogenases are redox enzymes. Okay. And so what is this? You basically take lactate and remove 2 protons and 2 electrons, which basically essentially means you are removing 2 hydrogen atoms, okay, from lactate to generate pyruvate. Okay. So where do those electrons go? Well, electrons go to NAD plus. Remember, NAD plus, NADP plus, FAD and FMN, those are electron acceptors. And so those are the species that will actually accept electrons. And so just keep that in mind. Now, I want to again emphasize how oxidation is the process that actually generates ATP, generates energy. And so here you are seeing oxidation states of carbon in biomolecules. Okay, this is an alkane, you can see, right? And then next, if you oxidize that alkane, you will generate alcohol. You oxidize this further, it will generate aldehyde or ketone. You oxidize this further, you will get carboxylic acids. And if you oxidize this further, you will end up generating carbon dioxide. So in the red, we are showing you different oxidation states of carbon, right? Terminal carbon. And so if you look here in CH3, right? Oxidation state of this carbon in this terminal methyl carbon is -3, right? Methane, it will be -4. So successively, you can see that in what about carbon dioxide? Carbon dioxide, it's the oxidation of carbon is +4. So you literally start from -3 and you are going to +4, right? So you are stripping away electrons from them. That's what it means. You know, this is how, and what happens to those electrons? Remember, those electrons will eventually go and transfer those electrons to respiratory chains. And then when in that process, a proton gradient is created, and that proton gradient actually comes through F0, F1 ATP synthase and generates ATP from ADP and inorganic phosphate. That's how you generate ATP. Okay, so in your textbook, they also want to show you in a slightly different way. Okay, what they are doing is they are actually showing you, giving you a feel for oxidation states of this carbon in the red as it is oxidized to different stages. Okay, and the way they do is that they actually show you who owns the electron. Okay, this is what they are trying to show you. The number that you see here on the right hand side, this is not a formal oxidation states. Students often get confused seeing this. That's why I'm going over this. Okay, the number that you see on the right for each compound here is the number of electrons owned by the red carbon. Okay, which is a rough expression of the oxidation state of that carbon. Okay, so when carbon is fully oxidized, they are showing you it owns 0 electrons. How? So here in methane, you can see that carbon in the pink and all 8 electrons, bonding electrons also in the pink. That carbon owns all 8 of them. Why? Because it turns out if you went and looked in Pauling scale, you'll see that carbon is more electronegative. Carbon's electronegativity is 2.55 and hydrogen is 2.2 at the Pauling scale. So all 8 ketones, that's why the number 8. In ethane, when it's a bond between carbon and carbon, they are showing you each one own only 1. So therefore, they're showing you 7. They're showing you 7, 6, 5, and you can go on. And so in carbon dioxide, carbon don't owe any electrons, and therefore it's highly oxidized. That's what they're showing you. I just wanted to spend a minute. All right. Now you must be curious to know why ATP is such an energy rich molecule, why its standard free energy of hydrolysis is minus 30 kilojoule per mole. And that is what is shown here. Okay, this is where chemistry comes into play. So they are showing you ATP molecule right on the top. They're not showing you sugar and bases. Don't worry about that. There are no charges there, ionizable groups, so no need to worry. But they are showing you the triphosphate group here. And you can see that in this at pH 7, there will be 4 negative charge. Okay, all these oxygens will lose its proton at pH 7 because of their pKa value. So it's a highly charged molecule where negative charges are on each of these phosphoryl oxygens next to each other almost. So there must be electrostatic repulsion. And therefore, that bond between these two individual phosphorus atoms, right, neighboring, must be very weak. And if you look carefully, this is an anhydride bond. Okay, remember, you make anhydride when you actually remove water molecule from an acid. So if you took phosphoric acid and remove a water molecule, you'll make an anhydride-like structure as shown here. And that's why they are very reactive. You remember, acid anhydrides are most reactive molecules. And so when water nucleophile attacks, simply leaving group leaves, ADP leaves, and you form inorganic phosphate. And that inorganic phosphate can actually resonance stabilize, right? So you have relief of charge repulsion upon hydrolysis that contributes to the delta G. Then you have formation of phosphate group, inorganic phosphate that can resonance stabilize. So you have second factor that will be resonance stabilization energy. And then you are generating ADP, which is again an acid. So that will dissociate to form a proton plus this conjugate base, right? So that's the ionization of ADP will create another favorable process. So 3 of those are shown here. And fourth one that is not shown here is that when you generate inorganic phosphate and ADP, they are very charged molecule. There are 2 different molecules with charges on them. So there is a salvation energy that actually also helps stabilize these 2 charged species in the product. Okay, so that would be the fourth contribution, if you want to say. And that's why delta G is all the way negative. You know, ATP is very eager to undergo hydrolysis. And so oftentimes when you have enzymes that actually bind ATP, you will see that those enzymes also have a binding factor, binding site for a cofactor like magnesium ion. So most kinases, you will have magnesium ion binding pocket, okay? And the way magnesium ion works out and helps out in catalysis is that it orients this gamma phosphate that needs to be transferred to the acceptor molecule. Okay, so it forms a hydrogen bonding interactions, or actually ionic interactions with the phosphoryl group. And by doing that, it also makes the phosphorus more electrophilic, because remember, it's sucking away the electron density from those oxygen-rich, electron-rich oxygens, and thereby making that phosphorus atom more prone to nucleophilic attack. Phosphorus becomes more electrophilic, and therefore you will see them, you'll see them found in several enzymes that use ATP and ADP, such as kinases. So this is nothing, we'll come back to this, but just to give you an idea that different types of cells have different requirement for ATP. Okay, muscle cells that are often needing a lot more energy, their ATP concentrations is maintained at 8 millimolar. They're showing you rat myocyte, but similar is true for humans as well. Okay, in neuronal cells, ATP concentration is around 3 millimolar. Okay, so average. One other interesting molecule that we will come to that when we talk about other chapters is this phosphocreatine molecule. Okay, phosphocreatine is another very energy rich molecule, and that's also present in very, very high concentrations in your muscle cells, like almost 30 millimolar, mark my word, millimolar. And that phosphocreatine molecule is actually utilized when you are going for all out exertion. Okay, that is used as an energy reservoir. Once your ATPs are depleted, phosphocreatine will make new ATP molecule. And in general, the concentrations of ATP in the cell is maintained above the equilibrium concentration, so that whenever a process needs ATP, it's readily available. Okay. So I'm just showing you some other energy rich molecules. Okay. And two such energy rich molecules are again derived from glycolysis: phosphoenol pyruvate and 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. These two are also highly energy rich molecule. And you can go back and look at the table. When you stare at that table, you will notice that right here. Well, they're showing you acetic anhydride. Unfortunately, it's not here. But yeah, I was under the impression they're shown here. But yeah, they're also very, very energy rich molecule. Okay, and you will see them, how they play a crucial role in metabolism. Okay, so let's look at this. First, phosphoenol pyruvate on the top. You see pyruvate structure, CH3CO carboxylate. 3 carbon molecule with a carboxylate adjacent to have a carbonyl attached. That carbonyl is attached to a methyl group. You should memorize that. And you can write its enol form right here in the middle. So what is PEP? PEP is phosphoenol pyruvate. Okay, molecule that's whose structure is shown here in the top left. So you can see here by a phospho group here, right? And enol and pyruvate structure right here. So when you use phosphoenol pyruvate and you hydrolyze this, you look at this molecule, just stare at it for a minute, for a second. You can see that this looks like a mixed anhydride group, right here. Yeah, and anhydrides are highly reactive. So when water goes, basically it will hydrolyze, it will generate inorganic phosphate, and you will generate this enol form of pyruvate shown here in the middle. And that enol form of pyruvate is not the most stable form at equilibrium. It's the keto form that is more stable. So therefore, this enol form of pyruvate undergoes tautomerization very rapidly. You can see the equilibrium arrow all the way to the right, generating this keto form of pyruvate, which is how the pyruvate exists. And this reaction is catalyzed by pyruvate kinase reaction. Both of these reactions are catalyzed by 2 steps. By 2 enzymes, pyruvate kinase and phosphoglycerate kinase, PGK. And these two are the 2 energy producing steps of glycolysis that we'll talk about them, step 9 and 10. But just hang in there. So you can see that, when cells are able to synthesize such high energy molecules, they can actually utilize these intermediates to generate ATP from ADP and inorganic phosphate, energy coupling, right? Thereby producing ATP and pyruvate molecule. The bottom one is 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. So again, 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate, just think about it. Glycerate must come from glycerol. Glycerate must have a carboxylate at the end, right? And then you must have 2 phosphate group, one at one position, one at 3 position. That's how you memorize the structure of 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. You can see glycerol side chain here, 1, 2, 3 carbon of glycerol side chain shown here. So very easy, glycerate and then phosphate group at 1 and 3. And you can already see that, yes, again, I'm seeing the same type of geometry as you saw up in phosphoenol pyruvate, a very, very reactive bond that can, hydrolyze. And exactly what happens, it can hydrolyze very rapidly to create 3-phosphoglyceric acid. And because it's an acid, it can ionize to give you 3-phosphoglycerate, and overall delta G is about minus 50 kilojoule per mole. So these are two other high energy intermediates that are utilized in the cell. Now, one reaction you will see many times, thioesters are heavily used in metabolism as opposed to oxygen esters. Okay, so oxygen esters are shown here. If you see the graph on the right hand side, I'm showing you an oxygen ester, right? Alcohol and then condensed with an acid, and you can see oxygen ester. Thioesters are shown here, and one such thioester is acetyl coenzyme A, if you remember, right? Acetyl coenzyme A, as shown here in top left, is a thioester with a very large negative standard free energy for hydrolysis. Okay, and these acetyl, acetyl coenzyme A, you will see them a lot. I don't think we talk enough about fatty acid synthesis in this class, but when you talk about synthesis of fatty acids in your Biochem 2, you'll notice that when you have to generate, let's say, 16 carbon fatty acids, you utilize this 2-carbon molecule, acetyl coenzyme A, to actually make this 16 carbon fatty acid. So you feed these 2 carbon units into the anabolic pathway. But it also plays very, very important role in many, many other reactions. And so that's what you're seeing. Acetyl coenzyme A hydrolysis is again highly favorable, minus 31 kilojoule, and that comes from hydrolysis and then the ionization of the acid itself. Together, both they contribute to minus 31 kilojoule per mole. But thioesters are more reactive, and that's one reason why they are utilized in biochemistry. And that's what is shown here in this plot. You can see that delta G for thioester hydrolysis is a lot higher, as you see here in the pink, than the hydrolysis of oxygen ester, as shown here in the pink again. Okay. But delta G for oxygen ester hydrolysis is around minus 20 kilojoule per mole. But for thioester, it's about minus 30. So this much, is shown here in the blue. Thioesters are this much more reactive, or if you want to call it other way, oxygen esters are stabilized by at least this much more energy, right? It's shown here in the blue arrows, double-headed arrows. Why? It turns out that it all depends. Remember, there are lone pairs. There would be lone pair on that sulfur atom as well as on the oxygen atom, right? So that lone pair can be resonance stabilized onto the carbonyl group. And if there is a good resonance stabilization, right, then this bond will be more stable, carbon-oxygen bond, right? If there is a poor resonance stabilization between the lone pair and the carbonyl carbon, then it will almost act as a single bond. It will be more unstable. And that's exactly what goes on. The orbital overlap between the carbonyl group and sulfur is not as good as the resonance overlap between the oxygen and the carbonyl group in esters, regular oxygen esters. And that's what makes thioesters more reactive. Cool, right? Oh, this is what the table I was looking for. All right, so you can see here that PEP, what we call phosphoenol pyruvate, PEP, its standard free energy of hydrolysis is minus 62 kilojoule per mole. And 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate is minus 50 kilojoule per mole. Cool. So there are some standard free energy they are shown. You should get just a feel for things, but don't try to memorize every one of them, okay? Now it turns out that when you have ATP molecule as shown here on the top, a nucleophile can attack at either one of the phosphoryl phosphorus, right? Alpha phosphorus, that is the phosphorus that is directly connected to the sugar ring, the beta phosphoryl group, which is in the middle, and the gamma phosphoryl group, which is the terminal one. Formation of glucose 6-phosphate from glucose, it's a terminal gamma phosphate that gets transferred. So leaving group is ADP. So that's what they're showing you, different places. Once you take the terminal group, transfer it to a nucleophile, then you have a phosphoryl transfer, your leaving group will be ADP, right? You'll move that bond to leave. You'll break that phosphorus oxygen bond. If nucleophile is attacking the middle phosphoryl group, then you'll have AMP as the leaving group, and you find this pyrophosphoryl. Pyro means 2-phosphoryl group. Pyrophosphoryl transfer to the nucleophile. But when you actually attack the alpha phosphoryl group, then we call it adenylyl transfer. Okay, adenylyl transfer, and then the leaving group is pyrophosphate. You should write this down and make sure you understand. So with that introduction, I want to show you something. Okay. It turns out that when people utilize ATP in a reaction, they think that ATP is somehow hydrolyzing, generating this energy, creating heat, and that's what is driving the reaction, endergonic reaction to completion. Okay. So oftentimes when people show reaction, in this case, glutamate converting into glutamine, all you're doing is you're adding an amine to that. So there are substrates, glutamate, amine, and ATP. The enzyme does this reaction is called glutamine synthetase. We'll talk about that in amino acid metabolism. And they show you like this: glutamate gets converted to glutamine. You utilize ATP, you make ADP, inorganic phosphate, and glutamine, right? That's the product. It is often written as one step, but contribution to ATP to this reaction, contribution of ATP to this reaction is actually a two-step process. The way the actual reaction works is that ATP will form this kind of enzyme bound intermediate. So carboxylate will attack terminal phosphoryl group of ATP, creating ADP and enzyme bound glutamyl phosphate. Again, you can notice here that that's highly reactive intermediate. And then amine attacks on that carbonyl, and then you form glutamine. Okay, so that's something that you should know. This is, you see fireflies. Fireflies are often, glowing when they fly. You have seen them glowing. And that reaction, that glow that you see, is actually a quanta of light is emitted by a specific reactions. That's what you are seeing. It's a bioluminescence cycle of firefly. How does it happen? It turns out that these fireflies produce this molecule luciferin, as shown here. Okay, luciferin will take ATP molecule and form this luciferyl adenylate intermediate. Okay, remember alpha attack, that carboxylate is going to attack, and you can see you have formed that. And then in the next step, molecular oxygen will come with the help of enzyme luciferase. It will convert this luciferyl adenylate to oxyluciferin. And in that process, it will generate light, a quanta of light, and of course produce carbon dioxide and AMP. And this oxyluciferin by several other enzymes can be regenerated to luciferin. And this is what happens every time you see a quanta of light. This reaction cycle is happening quite rapidly. And this luciferin-luciferase system has been widely utilized in biochemistry, molecular biology to monitor certain assays. Now, one thing you'll also notice is that we will not talk about this ever again, but it's not only ATP that is energy-rich molecule. In fact, if you produce GTP, UTP, DGTP, DATP, etc. You can all interconvert them. There is an enzyme called nucleoside diphosphate kinase that can take ATP and make any TP you want, any NTP or DNTP you want. Okay. So the way this reaction happens, catalysis happens, is that you take the ATP molecule, and this enzyme has a histidine residue, okay, in the active site. It will that histidine residue will attack gamma phosphate. You'll make ADP, and that enzyme will exist in the form of phosphohistidine. That's intermediate. Then it will take any NDPs, okay, that are available in the cell, and then transfer that gamma phosphate, the phosphate from histidine to that NDP to generate any NTP molecule you need, or cells need actually. So there is constant conversion possible from ATP, although we always talk about ATP, but there are GTPs and UTPs that are produced in the processes. Okay, so I apologize if I go by 5 minutes. If you have to leave, you can quietly leave the lecture, but I would encourage you to stick around so we can get through this lecture. Okay. Now, I have shown you that when you strip away electrons from reduced fuel, such as fatty acids and sugars, where do those electrons go? They go to electron carriers, specialized electron carriers. NAD plus are the phosphorylated form of NAD plus, which is NADP plus, or FAD or FMN. And I have shown you structures of those. And that's what is shown here. Okay. The business end of the molecule is shown here in the pink. And this molecule is able to do 2 electron redox processes. Okay, so it can accept 2 electrons. It cannot do 1 electron redox process. Okay, both NAD plus and NADP plus can do actually 2 electron redox process. So what this can do is this can actually accept 2 protons and 2 electrons, which if you think about it is a hydride ion, H minus. That hydride can be accepted either from the top phase of the molecule or from the bottom phase. They're showing you in the blue. Okay, so in that process, you would produce the reduced species of NAD plus, which is called NADH. This reduced species and oxidized species have very different absorption spectrum, as shown here, blue and red. And they can be utilized to monitor the reaction, enzyme catalyzed reaction, right? If it's a redox process, you can just monitor the progress of the reaction by actually monitoring, let's say, generation of NADH at 340 nanometer. So that's something that you should know. But the key to here note is that enzymes are stereospecific. So they are able to transfer that hydride from top phase or bottom phase. Okay. And so in biological systems, there are different enzymes that will accept that hydride group either from top phase or bottom phase. And that's what is shown here. Either they are A type or B type. No need to memorize them, but you should just know. And that brings me to this very interesting slide that I actually talk a little bit about. In the biosynthesis of NAD plus and NADP plus, you actually need a vitamin called niacin. Niacin is also known as vitamin B3 or nicotinic acid, shown here in this rectangular box. Okay. And nicotinic acid, the name came from nicotinic acid because in laboratory, nicotinic acid was produced from nicotine. So that's why they called nicotinic acid, but it's more appropriate biological word would be niacin, right? And so you basically to generate an NAD plus and NADP plus, you need vitamin niacin here, right? And you need tryptophan, both. And so you can actually, if you don't get them from your sources, then you can have trouble. And it turns out that there is a story in South America where maize was a staple food, maize, which is kind of corn. And maize has to undergo a process, okay, a nixtamalization, they call it, where maize must be treated properly. Okay, what is that process? That grain must be soaked in an alkaline solution, such as a saturated solution of lime water, they call it calcium hydroxide. Saturated solution of calcium hydroxide is lime water, and so it must be soaked, okay, and then utilized. If you don't do this process, then from maize you cannot get this very important molecule in your diet, and therefore it could lead to a disease called pellagra. And pellagra was very common in the South American people, and they didn't know for a long time why they were getting this horrible disease. The disease, as you know, is marked by 4Ds, they call it. Okay, people who are suffering from pellagra, they will have diarrhea, they will have dementia, they will have skin issues, which is dermatitis, and they will die eventually if they're not treated properly. Okay, very bad. But simply you take maize and you soak it with this lime water, and then you have exposed your niacin and tryptophan, and you can actually get these vitamins, and you can actually make NAD plus and NADP plus, and you can utilize this NAD plus and NADP plus in generation of ATP. Okay, so this is a very interesting molecule that you should know. But what I wanted to show you also here is that if you have pellagra, you can treat the pellagra by using, you know, either nicotinamide or nicotinic acid. You can feed them and people will recover. Okay, but no nicotine. No, nicotine only you get from smoking. Nicotine is no good. It is not a substitute for vitamin niacin. Okay, so don't smoke. This is to show you that unlike NAD plus or NADP plus, flavin nucleotides can participate in both 1 electron and 2 electron redox processes. Remember, I told you NAD plus and NADP plus can only do 2 electron redox process, but this FAD and FMN can actually do both 1 electron and 2 electron redox processes. And if you remember, both FAD and FMN contain this isoalloxazine ring, right? That's the business end of the molecule. And you can actually do 1 electron transfer to generate this semi-quinone derivative. Then you can add another electron if need to be, and then you can have fully reduced form of FAD or FMN, which is FADH2 and FMNH2. That's how biochemists show these reactions. So there are certain enzymes that actually use FMN and FAD coenzymes in their reactions, and some of them are shown here. You will see many of them in this class. NADS dehydrogenase, which is complex 1. You will see that FMN is involved. Succinate dehydrogenase, again, you will see FAD is involved. And so we'll talk about them as we go through. That actually concludes the lecture. Let me stop the recording here. I apologize again for going a little bit over. Stop.